Hey everyone, so I'm currently at the Catholic Answers office right now doing one of my quarterly visits here in San Diego. And it's just been fun hanging out, going through the building, seeing everybody that I normally see on Zoom or on Skype. So it's been great. But today, what I wanted to share with you is an interview that I did with Eric Sammons. He's the editor at Crisis Magazine. This was for his Crisis podcast, Crisis Point, I think is the name of the podcast. I'll link to it below. But be sure to check out Crisis Magazine, check out Eric's podcast. I wanted to share some of that interview with you where we talk about apologetics, ecumenism, and Pope Francis. So take a look.
Now, apologetics, of course, has been practiced since the time of Christ. I assume the Jews probably practiced it even before that, but right. It's been practiced by Christians since the time of Christ. But in the 1970s, particularly, it got a bad name. And I feel like my understanding of the history, having lived through some of it myself, is that Carl Keating, at least in this country, kind of single-handedly brought it back from the dead. And I mean, I know some others did, but I mean, he really was instrumental.
Well, I want to, I'm going to grab here. I'm going to disappear out of the frame. Hold on. I'm not leaving. It's on the floor. I got to grab this. Not just him. I have this little book here. Catholic Apologetics Today, Answers to Modern Critics by Father William Most.
So, right. Yes, that was a big one as well. Absolutely. I remember reading Catholicism Fundamentalism. That was a big one for me. But really, Catholic Answers, Carl Keating, Father Most, they kind of brought it back. But it was dead. And it was kind of dead.
It was on life support for sure.
Life support is probably, but yes, that's a better way to put it. But people really thought that it was wrong to do this. And I've started to see some of that coming back, that people, in fact, I saw an article recently where they're kind of attacking kind of conservative and traditional Catholics, and they're saying it's based on this idea that you have answers to questions or something like that. Why do you think, why is apologetics denigrated in some quarters of the church?
That's a hard one, because what's interesting here, when we think of apologetics, it's had a rich history. A great book to read on this is Cardinal Avery Dulles' History of Apologetics. Goes at it from really the 2nd century onward. You see against pagans, counter-reformation, through modernism, against the Anglican controversies in the 19th century, Newman. And then in the early 20th century, you have people like Frank Sheed, doing the Catholic Evidence Guild. He was doing Catholic Answers back in the 30s, essentially. But then after the Second Vatican Council, I think there was a concern that it was conflicting with the goal of ecumenism, the goal of seeking out building bridges with other religions, other Christian denominations, other religions, and that if practiced in a triumphal way or in a closed-minded way, it harms that ecumenical movement. And here I want to be fair to both sides. There are brands of apologetics that can be harmful to ecumenism, like apologetics that will seek to refute, let's say, Islam or Mormonism or other religions, and it doesn't understand the very religion it's trying to refute. So if I go to a Muslim and say, well, here's the problem with Mohammedanism, you a Mohammedan, they would say, I'm not a Mohammedan. I am a Muslim. I don't worship Muhammad. I've already gotten off on the wrong foot, essentially. I've misunderstood. So they're not going to hear what I have to say. And so that can be harmful. But a good apologetic is essential, because the goal of ecumenism is to, we're separated from people who disagree with us. We want to close the gap as much as possible, but then we don't want to stop and just sing Kumbaya. We want to close the gap so that jumping the gap to bring people to Christ is more manageable. And I think that's the goal to see. And it's hard when people will try to pit the two against each other. No, like if we do ecumenism, say with the Orthodox, we can say, hey, there's actually a lot we can learn from you guys on different issues. So we get closer and closer and closer. When the gap is smaller, it's easier to do apologetics when the gap is small versus when the gap is wide. So you're right, but I think that the people in the 70s onwards kind of had this feeling that it's either antithetical or it's not the laity's job. That's what priests do. That's what theologians do. That that's more of a Protestant thing, not a Catholic thing. And yeah, I think Carl, Patrick Madrid, Tim Staples, Jimmy, and others really revitalized this as a lay notion. But I've seen this online, certain social media circles, and it's. I always ask people, they'll say things like apologetics is dead, or the last thing the church needs are apologists. And I ask them, well, what do you mean by that? Like, I agree with you, it doesn't need bad apologists, Just like it doesn't need bad liturgists, it doesn't need bad evangelists, it doesn't need bad bishops, it doesn't need bad people who do corporal works of mercy in a bad way. You could do that in a bad way too. It doesn't mean it's wrong to do these things. It means we should do them the right way.
Yeah, and I also think that, wouldn't you say that in the modern mind, there's this idea that we can't have answers, that we can't have definitive answers. And I've seen that's another criticism of apologists. They think they know everything, or they think they have a final answer on thing. How would you respond to somebody say, well, why do you think you have the right answer on this?
Right. So a few points jump out at me. First, this position, if you take it too literally, is self-refuting. You can't have any answers, but I know apologists don't have answers. Now, that's just a quick observation. To be fair to the position, and that's something that I'm trying to encourage in others when I do apologetics, when I do debates, when I do dialogues, to be fair to the other side. Like, and being charitable isn't just about not calling other people names. Being charitable also means correctly understanding your opponent's position and representing it well before showing what's wrong with it, which is what Aquinas does in the Summa, for example. So I think that when you see these criticisms, there is some truth to some of them when apologetics is done badly. So when you have apologists say, oh, well, here's the obvious solution to this problem, or here on this issue, this is the right answer. An apologist can get in trouble if he fails to acknowledge, oh, well, there is another solution that could be offered. The apologist who says, oh, that there's only one way to resolve this particular open theological question in the church. Like, let's say they only advocate for a very strict kind of Thomism with predestination. And they don't even say there is all other things like Molinism and what Duns Scotus says. If you act like, oh, I've solved it, I've got this rigid set of answers, and you overplay your hand, that's problematic. That you should be confident in those things which are definitive, and you can talk about the variety of options with questions that are more open. But I do think that the critics who say this, to be honest with you, Eric, I think a lot of them, they have bought into a modern heresy affecting the church, and that would be a kind of universalism. Idea that, look, everybody's basically going to heaven. We don't really need to convert people. So apologists, the only thing they'll do is they'll come off snotty or arrogant and drive people away. That we should just focus on works of mercy and the liturgy, and that will draw people in, and the arrogant apologist will push people away. Yeah, we don't need the arrogant apologist, but some people need the answers. They might say, hey, this is beautiful, but I don't think it's true.
Right. Now, we were talking about the tension between ecumenism and apologetics. Now, my most recent book is pretty critical of how ecumenism is done and has been done for quite some time, because I tend to believe that it ends up being people who just want to talk about how great the other religion is and just then go to their cocktail party and that's it. There's no real sense of, okay, here's where we think you're wrong. Right. And you can tell us where you think we're wrong, but we want you to know where we think you're wrong.
Or we say we think that you're wrong, and the other side may say, well, actually, we agree with what you say. We're just using different wording. Like, right. We look at the efforts that have come in discussions, Catholics and Orthodox discussions, or the joint declaration on justification between Catholics and Lutherans. Once again, about bridging the gap, but still recognizing, well, here is something that we have not resolved yet, and to offer to the other side, here's the problem. So I agree with you, Eric, that I think that when ecumenism is sort of done by like these advisory bodies, and you're right, that it's just about meeting in a fancy hotel, and we had a nice banquet hall and a PowerPoint, and that when it's done in that way, when it's not done with a serious attitude of here's where we agree, here's where we disagree, here's our arguments we would like you to wrestle with. That's what, but however, I think ecumenism, it can be done in a good way. Like, I think I try to model that myself on my podcast, that I will do debates or I will do informal dialogues with people that are nice to chat with, and I've had these with a wide variety of people. That is where you can have that authentic ecumenism. Say, here's where we disagree. Here's where I'm not sold. Or, hey, here's an argument I really need you to wrestle with. But I think we're going to see that more in the personal interactions or among scholars who really take it seriously.
Right. And that was kind of my experience because I really got exposed to Catholicism through the pro-life movement. And that was an ecumenical effort. And we would get together, and a lot of times we'd come together and we'd agree with stuff, the Catholics and the Protestants, but then we'd also one-on-one at the abortion mills or afterwards, like that, when we go out for coffee after we were praying at the abortion mill, we would then have our debates about, okay, well, here's why I think you're wrong, and here's why I think you're right, stuff like that. And it was beautiful. I mean, it was a way that we were working together.
And so the other side is correct. They'll say, well, you don't need apologetics. You just need to build a friendship and a relationship with people to draw them to Christ. And I would say you're correct. We should do that. That's one of the most effective kinds of evangelism are these relationships of mutual respect and friendship when we have things in common. I would say that in many cases it is necessary. In some cases that will be sufficient to move someone to want to consider Catholicism. But in other cases it won't. That's why, I mean, it's like saying, I don't need a flathead screwdriver. Why would I need that? I can always use my regular screwdriver or other things to get my job done. You're like, well, you might have been able to for many of these jobs. You may come across a job where, actually, I do need this. If I don't have this, I can't get this screw out. And you'll be glad you had the tool when you needed it, even if there were many cases where you had the tool and you did not need it. And I think that's true of apologetics.
Right. Now, when engaging in apologetics that's a very broad term. Obviously, sure. We're Catholic, and you engage with apologetics with anybody who's not Catholic. How do you distinguish between apologetics with atheists, Jews, Muslims, Protestants, Orthodox, and because you do it with everybody, it seems like. And how do you really go about distinguishing between how you approach those different groups?
Right. So what I would try to do is understand where the person is coming from and honestly assess, the gap that I have with them and see what is the fundamental issue that we're disagreeing about and not get sidetracked on other issues. So with atheists, I'm going to focus on the evidence for and against the existence of God. I'm also going to understand that amongst these groups, some people are closer than others. So I have more common ground. So, for example, it's not proper to speak of evangelizing the Eastern Orthodox. What we speak of is unification with the Orthodox. To say that the title of church can be applied to your churches because you have valid holy orders and apostolic succession. And so we can recognize that. When it's with Protestant ecclesial communities, then I would say, well, we have a firm foundation in the Trinity and a valid baptism. So affirming the similarities we have, but I mean, it could be, you might say, well, what do you do like an atheist? You got no similarities. Not necessarily. I had a wonderful conversation with an atheistic apologist recently, but he has been very critical of atheistic tribalism. Like other atheists have criticized him because he's very pro Second Amendment, for example. And we had a good chat about how you can take the atheist out of religion, but you can't take the religion out of the atheist. You still want to create your codes of behavior, your groupthink. And so even there, we found a common ground. Now it was cultural and social common ground, but sometimes that can be helpful. That builds a bridge and caring about evidence and logic. So that's when I'm engaging people, I just want to see what brings us closer together and then try to really understand their position and being very careful to not place them in a monolith. So that example of, the atheist I spoke to, he's not like your social justice raving liberal lunatic online. He's unique. And the same is true when you look at other apologists or other people you might engage. Just as like if you say, if someone says, I spoke to someone, they're Catholic, you and I both know that word is so elastic.
Right.
Like they're Catholic. That could be that. I mean, there's a big difference between Father James Martin and Father Ripperger, Yeah. so that's why, but we Catholics, we can be guilty of that too. If we say, well, he's Protestant. Well, there's a big difference between Protestants, even Muslims or Jews. So that's why it's important when we engage others to get past the label and really understand what is their particular view globally, like which religion are they, but also where do they fall within that particular religion or lack of religion.
Right. So you're trying to figure out where they stand, what you have in common with them. It's funny you mentioned that because I know a number of Orthodox, and I know, like, I have a friend who's an Orthodox priest who basically thinks all Catholic sacraments are invalid and that we're all basically graceless and out of the church and all that, and out of the true church. And I know other Orthodox priests who are very much more accepting of Catholicism and understanding that we have valid orders, things like that. So you have to kind of know who it is you're talking to. And so now let's talk a little bit more about specifics of today. Sure. One of the great challenges I know a lot of people Catholics have, when they're trying to engage in apologetics with maybe even non-Catholics or people, is the scandals within the church today specifically. Now, the moral challenges, the moral problems of leaders, that's one thing. But I mean like today, where we have a pope who, I'll be diplomatic and say he says some problematic things. And so when we're trying to say, here's an example I had where a woman wanted to, when I was working for a diocese, she wanted to set up a group that was supportive of homosexuals. Her son had come out as gay, and basically she wanted a group that was going to be basically endorsing homosexual behavior. And I said, no, that's against church teaching, whatever. This was in 2013, 12 or something like that. Well, then Pope Francis came. He said the famous words, "Who am I to judge?" and some other things like that. And then she basically then was like, well, the Pope says it's okay. Now, I know he didn't actually say that, but the point is that he's winked and nudged at times. And so it basically it makes it where they're comparing, they're just saying, okay, the Pope says this, but you say this. Well, who are they going to go with? And I don't blame them for saying, I'm going to go with the Pope. But what do we do in those situations where we do seem to be going against what the Pope seems to at least be indicating, if not explicitly saying?
Well, I think there's multiple strategies one can employ. And you might use them in different order. I mean, the basic line here is if you're engaging someone, you have to make sure if they're saying that the church teaches X when it actually doesn't teach X, you'll need a primer on understanding, well, how do we know what the church teaches? My friend Jimmy Akin has a wonderful book on this subject called Teaching with Authority that goes over that magisterial statements from bishops or the Pope have different levels of authority. So at one point, you'll need catechesis with an individual to say, look, different statements that the Pope makes have different levels of authority. There's a difference between, something that dogmatically defines something like the Immaculate Conception versus an impromptu answer on an airplane to let people know, look, certainly you would agree what the Pope says has different levels of authority. And that also is in union with what the church teaches. Because you say, well, look, the Pope doesn't contradict the church, right? No, so then you go to the Catechism, paragraph 20 through 57 on homosexuality. But you can also, before this, maybe show the person, you have to be careful not to act like you're trying to really grill the person, but you might want to show that they're being a little self-serving sometimes, to say, you know what, you're right, we got to listen to Pope Francis. So, when Pope Francis said abortion is like hiring a hitman, you would agree abortion's just like that, right? And so, because that's the thing with Pope Francis, he's the gift that keeps on giving. So it's funny, you watch the roller coaster online of, people like, Advocate magazine, a pro-LGBT magazine, and others, like Pope Francis is man of the year for them. And then the CDF, under his permission, releases a document that prohibits blessing same-sex unions, for example. Which includes that it's released under his permission, and they're having to backpedal like, oh well, or and he'll say one thing, you're right, and then it's a roller coaster for everybody. Right. So I think if you're shrewd, if someone is taking something the Pope has said to try to promote a dissenting view of church teaching, sometimes it's fun to see, well, what do you do with this very heavy-handed Orthodox thing the Pope has said? Will you go with that too, or are you just cherry picking when the Pope, says problematic things that happen to favor what you think? So that has to be done with due caution. You want to be gracious with people, but I think that can be helpful to show, look, are you cherry picking? Or are you listening to the whole of magisterial teaching?
Right. And related to this, now this one, a little bit more tricky. There's situations in which, as Catholics, we simply just don't agree with the Pope and what he said. We think something he said is wrong, and I'm talking, of course, not about doctrinal issues like the Trinity or something like that, but maybe in him pushing for the vaccine, or
like a prudential judgment.
Yeah, but even when he, like the death penalty,
Sure.
probably is the best example in my mind,
Right.
where it really, to me, I mean, I've said this before, it really, to me, sounds like he's just simply contradicting church teaching on this, because the death penalty is clearly
Right.
justifiable, in certain circumstances. And I understand, like, Pope John Paul II was making it more like it's not really necessary in the developed world, all that. But then we get, because I know one of the criticisms that Catholic Answers has gotten is that sometimes it's a little too willing to try to defend the Pope on some of the more problematic things it says. And is there a role in, I mean, how does it I'm not even sure what my question here is at this point, but like, I just know a lot of Catholics have challenges when they're talking to their friends who are either fallen away Catholics or not Catholics, they don't want to Pope-splain. But yet they also want to be respectful of the papacy. How do we do both those things?
Well, it is a fine line to walk between two errors, and it's something that I have learned over the course of Francis's pontificate to walk, and I've tried to grow in that area, at least in the past few years, of addressing these things. Because you're right, because prudential matters are one thing, and I'll discuss that a little bit after this. But this is more the question. Well, it's interesting, as an apologist, people will bring up objections to the faith. And one common objection from Protestants is, the actions of this particular pope actually show Catholicism is false. The common examples were Pope Liberius, Honorius, Vigilius, from the early Middle Ages, things like that. And so you'll go through. And so I think your question seems to be concerned. What about people who add Francis to this armada, essentially? What should we do if we agree with them? How do we respond? And you're right. So there's the two errors. One would be a kind of ultramontanism that basically it's as if the Pope, as every utterance, is infallible and will bend over backwards to defend him, and not ever just say, yeah, he just really biffed it on this one, But then there's another view that goes a bit too far, that would almost seem to deny the Holy Spirit's promise that it will prevent the church from habitually falling into these errors, or you it's almost maybe tabloid-esque a little bit, so much that you sound like those fundamentalist Protestants from the 80s. Like, I've heard some online Catholics talk about the Pope. I'm like, who is this, Jack Chick? Like, I thought about it'd be a fun game, like, very angry traditionalist anonymous Twitter Catholic and Jack Chick, the famous very anti-Catholic cartoonist, putting their quotes together. I'd be like, oh wow, these almost look identical. So you don't want to fall into either of those traps. So I think my response to that would be, and I think this is something hopefully the Catholic Answers has grown in, I've tried to grow in. And actually, it's interesting, something like this did come up in my rebuttal to a Eastern Orthodox apologist named Jay Dyer. And so Jay brought up, look at what Francis has done with the death penalty. And what was funny is he sounded a lot like Taylor Marshall with his criticism, but then the conclusion is, therefore become Orthodox. And so my reply there, and I think this is important, is, like I said earlier, we should offer a lot of different options for people. I follow Jimmy in this regard, and I think he's very good at this, to say, well, here's a difficulty, and there's a few different ways a person might address the difficulty. And just allow, hey, there's certain things we can't say. We can't say the Pope can formally bind the church to heresy or something like that. But we could offer a lot of different options. So one could offer the option that what the Pope has taught, that this falls under a prudential judgment that does not require the religious submission of mind and will, and to say that this is erroneous, but it does not fall under an error that is covered under papal infallibility. So you could say that's one option. Another option that could be presented is that this is a development in Catholic social teaching, and give examples about how different social teachings can develop. Like, one might say with the death penalty, the church always considered it moral to exercise the death penalty for a wide variety of crimes, even public theft, hunting on the Lord's land, and a wide variety of crimes were seen. It was permissible to use a penalty of death to instill public order. But over time, the crimes that are suitable for death, it shrinks and gets more and more narrow till it's just like murder or treason. And the idea here is maybe you see there's a trajectory in development that the justifications keep getting narrower and narrower. over time. So that, as I said, those are two options. So I think that's helpful. That look, we're a big tent. People are going to have different views about which prudential judgments or even theological observations that are made or opinions of prelates or the Pope are, the value of them. But I think that can be helpful when these things come up to put forward all the options. You can almost put it as like, here's my preferred one. And if that argument doesn't work, here's my fallback position. And all of them, it's like I have all these safety nets, if you will, that catch me before I fall into schism or leave the faith or something. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think the challenge is, some of it's interesting because I feel like some of the more ultramontanists, at least, they're saying exactly what I was told as a Protestant by Catholic apologists. No, we don't do that. We don't think everything the Pope says is infallible and things like that. We don't treat him as a divine oracle. I think honestly, like, to me, I think the people I've talked to about this when it comes to Pope Francis, we're willing to understand that there's tons of things he says that are just problematic, but they're just like, it's an airplane interview. He has certain politics that we don't agree with, which is fine, whatever. But it's when he hits on, I think the big ones are probably the death penalty, the communion for divorced and remarried, where it's like, it looks like he is changing a church teaching that can't be changed. And the whole structure of Catholicism does really depend on it. And I think I know people, and I'm sure you do too, who have left the church or following because of this, because they feel like, okay, the foundation is crumbling because we said the Pope cannot change unchangeable church teaching. And yet at least to them, it appears that he has. So, and I know we've had the debate. You've been involved with it about change, what it means to change church teaching.
Right. Sure.
And we've both written about that. And I think we come at it from different perspectives. But I think that's really a issue of apologetics that I think is causing a lot of issues, which some of that, I try to look at more optimistically, is it helps refine our apologetics.
Right.
These things happen. But how would you say those, how does it not make the foundation crumble? How would you answer those who, I don't think it does, but I know people who do.
Right. And I think that where it will become problematic, that as an apologist, if you put forward an extremely strong, indefensible claim about something, that this never happens, or the church never does this, or, things don't change, how you articulate it, you have to be careful so that you're not left open to a counterexample, whether it's in the current age or in the past 2,000 years, when you look at things like how church fathers have articulated matters in the past versus the development in modern science and things like that. Because you could go too far and say, well, look, if the fathers are in agreement on something, then you're bound to believe that. And but the problem is, well, no, you have to tailor the understanding of what that in particular means, because then you might bind people to believe in outdated scientific theory. I'm sure the fathers of the church all believe in the theory of the humors, that our health system is basically 4 fluids going together. We're not bound to believe that, but that would also apply to scientific observations about the age of the earth or the development of life. That could lead you into problematic areas if you're in conflict with other things. So I think that you're right. Like the concerns that are brought up, that you just have to make sure that that what you're putting forward, that you use this as an opportunity to refine the position you put forward. And I think then in charity is to offer people, it's kind of like, they're looking at Catholicism. They might say, because it's interesting, like when I'm engaging people who are Eastern Orthodox, many of them will say, well, I can't be a Catholic because I think Thomism is bonkers. And I think that Thomas Aquinas he doesn't make sense. He's crazy. It goes against everything the Cappadocian Fathers taught,
Right.
And so I would say, well, okay, so there's 2 options here. You could defend Thomism, which I think is a fine thing to do. Or you might say, hey, you know what? If you find this problematic, there are other ways to articulate these theological issues that you might find to be more like a Franciscan way, or other things like that. So just like if I offer, let's say Pope Francis and the death penalty, that's why for me, like I'd say, here's my preferred solution. Someone might say, that sounds like you're grasping at straws. I can't really buy that. All right. here's what Eric Sammons would say. And, and he's faithful to magisterium and he's Catholic. You might prefer that. So I think when we're engaging others, we should be open to presenting people a variety of orthodox proposals, even if we're not a big fan of them, as long as they're orthodox and have not contradicted, the positive faith, then that can serve the cause.
Right. And sometimes what I do, I just say, I don't know how to reconcile it.
Yes, that's another approach.
I mean, because the fact is, I do know I don't think there's so much evidence for Catholicism in every other way. The fact that in this one area, I'm not able to reconcile it with my brain doesn't make me lose my faith in the fact that everything else. It just means that, okay, my puny brain can't reconcile that.
Well, there's a parallel here that if you say, well, the Pope said this, but the Catechism says that, this seems contradictory, therefore Catholicism is false. If you walk in that mindset of, hey, there is an apparent contradiction in my faith, therefore the faith is not true, you're only going to get about 10 steps. What do you do when you read the Bible and you've got atheists who have assembled 1,001 Bible contradictions? Mark 2:26, it says that Jesus said when Abiathar was high priest, when the Old Testament clearly says it was his father Ahimelech. But then what do I do in those situations? You could say, first, if you've never studied it, I don't know, that's weird. But I know Jesus walked out of his own tomb. He established a church. So I'm going to go with him and put a little asterisk next to this thing I don't understand. And you could do the same thing if Pope Francis says something that I don't quite understand what's going on here. Because if you have that rigid mentality to warn someone, hey, look, you're going to be out the door. You're not just going to give up the Pope. If you say, hey, apparent contradiction, this doesn't work, you're going to leave Christianity. You can even believe in God because you'll say, hey, God's all good, there's evil. Apparent contradiction, I don't know how to resolve it. If you have this rigid mentality where if there's an apparent contradiction, I'm out the door, you're going to be an atheistic nihilist. So I think what you said is very good, that you can say, you could present possible options, but it's fine to be humble and say, I'm not sure, but I have all this other evidence, whether it's a Bible contradiction or a contradiction in magisterial texts. I know there's a God. There has to be a God that created everything. I know that Jesus' resurrection is the only thing that makes sense of why Christianity got started in the first place. And the Catholic Church is the only thing that makes sense of how Christianity grew in the first 300 years and onward. And then from there, you've got your anchor, and you've got these apparent contradictions, at least that shouldn't give you as much work. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.